discussion and debate in our country. With that, let me start by just kind of sharing my take by way of an overview of what's happening in the relationship right now. And then we'll drill down into specific issues and other specific topics as we go forward. But bottom line, I think that the U.S. China relationship is at a modern era low point. We are probably at the single lowest point in certain respects in the relationship that we have seen since normalization. And that's saying something, considering that the United States-China relationship has certainly had ups and downs over the years. And we've had some good times, we've had some tough times, we've had challenging moments. And I think the moment that we're in right now is probably the single most challenging moment that we've seen in this relationship, dating back to the normalization of U.S. China relations that occurred on January 1st, 1979. So we have had 41 years of normalized relations, and this is the toughest that things have been. I think one data point that illustrates just how difficult and strained the relationship is right now is the fact that the United States saw fit to shut down the Chinese Consulate General in Houston, Texas, in my native home state, where I'm located as we speak, of Texas. And China had a consulate in Houston. The United States administration made the judgment that it needed to be shut down and did so. And now that consulate is no longer functioning. All the people are gone. I think they're all back in Beijing now. And meanwhile, as a reciprocal or tit-for-tat measure, China closed down the U.S. Consulate General in Chengdu, also in the southwest part of China. And now the two nations have one less diplomatic mission each, representing their interests in the respective country. I've never seen anything like this happen, certainly in the U.S.-China relationship. It's unprecedented. It's, I think, also unprecedented more generally for a nation to choose to shut down an entire consulate during a time of peace. I think it wouldn't be unheard of if two countries were at war or about to go to war to see something like this happen. I think it is unprecedented for something like this to happen during a time of peace. And I think it's an illustration of how dramatically things have deteriorated in the U.S.-China relationship. I should also note, by way of just this kind of general overview of where things are in the relationship right now, that the language that we see employed, that we're seeing employed by U.S. political figures, from the president to other members of the administration, cabinet secretaries, members of Congress, and others, the language we're seeing in reference to China is, I think, tougher and harsher than we have ever seen in the modern era. One could cite any number of examples, but we've had the sitting U.S. Secretary of State refer to the Chinese Communist Party as the greatest challenge or threat of our era. We had a speaker at the Republican National Committee just a few nights ago, the Republican National Convention just a few nights ago that nominated or renominated President Trump for a second term. We saw a speaker there, a man originally from China and now based in the United States, referred to China as, quote, an enemy of humanity. Words like that are, I've never heard at a Republican or Democratic National Convention in the past, and now they're fairly commonplace, at least at the Republican National Convention. And I'll talk a little bit about the partisan distinctions and the way that the two parties in our nation are talking about China and construing China and policymaking or legislating with respect to China. But certainly at the Republican National Convention, this kind of language was there. And as another and final data point, both President Trump and Secretary of State Pompeo, when the latter spoke from Israel as part of the convention speeches, both President Trump and Secretary Pompeo used the term the China virus. The China virus, that's the term that they specifically and pointedly used in their comments. Not a scientific term, but certainly a political term. The scientific term is COVID-19, but that's obviously the use of the term, quote, China viruses is a part of this escalating rhetoric that we see around China, particularly, and I would say disproportionately on the Republican side of the aisle, but to a certain degree across the partisan aisle in our country. So things are in a very tough place. And I think it's important to kind of look at the different issues that are contributing to the frictions between our nations and talk a little bit about each one before going to an assessment of the Trump administration's approach and other topics. Let me start with probably the dominant issue of 2020, and certainly the dominant issue of this year in general, but certainly with respect to U.S. China relations, and that is the issue of COVID-19. The fact is, COVID-19 has had a profound and negative impact on the U.S. China relationship. It has had a profound and negative impact on the way that Washington views, official Washington views China. And it has had a profound and negative impact on the way that the American people perceive of China. And all of those statements are borne out by extensive public opinion polling, nonpartisan, that makes it clear that COVID-19 is a turning point in an already strained relationship and a turning point in a negative direction. I think the fundamental point that I would make about COVID-19 is simply that one would have to go back to the Korean War that ended in 1953 to find an instance in which China took American lives and literally killed Americans on the battlefield in that case, in the case of the Korean War that was waged from 1950 to 1953. And ever since that time, whatever conflicts the United States and China have had, whatever disagreements, whatever different ideologies and different ideological prisms through which we see the world, whatever debates we've had around policy or around even very contentious issues, generally our countries have not taken the lives of each other, of each other's citizens, with a couple of tragic exceptions in which the United States did in fact take Chinese life. For example, in the 1999 bombing of the Belgrade embassy in the Chinese embassy in Belgrade, in which 3 Chinese citizens perished as a result of a U.S. bomb hitting that facility. But for the most part, there hasn't been loss of life inflicted, and certainly not willfully inflicted by either side. Today in this country, there is a large swath of the American public that has embraced a narrative that has been put out by, in particular, some political figures in Washington, principally on the Republican side, to a degree, the president, certainly the Secretary of State, presidential advisors, others in the executive branch, and quite a few, typically Republicans in the United States Congress, that have made the point that in their judgment with which I disagree, but in their judgment, China wittingly and knowingly and intentionally unleashed this virus on America for the purpose of killing Americans and for the purpose of damaging our economy and our society. That is, I think, not a majority view in this country, but it is a view held by a lot of significant people who, by virtue of their positions at least, one might refer to as serious people. And so that narrative has started to take hold in this country. And thus there is an idea out there in public opinion in this country about China, that China has now done something it hadn't done since 1953. It has willfully taken American lives. And when you think of it that way, whether one accepts or doesn't accept that particular interpretation, then one can start to understand why COVID-19 has led to a dramatic and historical shift in a negative direction in terms of U.S. sentiment toward China. And we've seen that borne out in polling conducted by Pew and Gallup and any other number of American, very reputable and authoritative and nonpartisan American public opinion polling firms. Bottom line today, about 2/3 of Americans say that they have a negative view of China or an unfavorable view of China when the historic average over the last 30 years or so, or 27, 28 years, up until COVID-19, has been more in the range of 45 to 50% holding negative views. So we have seen a kind of once in a generation shift to a much more negative sentiment in this country toward China, and COVID-19 was the driver of that. That said, the administration and other commentators who have sought to blame China for having, in their judgment, intentionally unleashed this plague on us, in quotes, that has been driving a lot of that sentiment. And meanwhile, the sentiment has been enabling that type of rhetoric, and we have a kind of mutually reinforcing dynamic. So that's COVID-19. Let me say a little bit about Hong Kong, another issue that has been in the news very recently. Hong Kong, in the last several years, has been a place where there's been a certain amount of unrest, a lot of protesting in the streets. There has been a lot of evident dissatisfaction or discontent on the part of the people of Hong Kong. Hundreds of thousands, millions, certainly cumulatively millions of people have taken to the streets in recent years to express dissatisfaction with any number of things. And long story short, as a result, China about 2 months ago put into place and formally implemented a new law governing Hong Kong called the National Security Law. And the National Security Law essentially criminalizes certain types of speech and certain types of activity that is judged to be seditious or damaging to Hong Kong's social stability, or treasonous in some ill-defined way as yet, or supporting of violence or terrorism, et cetera, et cetera. And the idea is that even comments, not just actions and not just violent actions, but that even statements that a person could make orally or in writing could subject that individual to criminal liability under this new law, a law where many of the key terms are not rigorously defined. The law is, in my judgment, and the judgment of many, problematic, very problematic at multiple levels. Mostly, I think, and most fundamentally, in the sense that the key definitions of what it means to be, what the criminal definitions are, or definitions of criminal activity are, a lot of those definitions are very unclear and vague. That's problematic. Also problematic, among other elements of the law, is the fact that China is extending an extraterritorial jurisdictional reach of the law to the entire globe. So that the letter of the law states very clearly, if a citizen of another country who is in his or her own country makes a statement that is deemed by the Chinese legal authorities to be criminal pursuant to the terms of the national security law, then China can issue an arrest warrant for that individual and hold them criminally liable, at least theoretically, for the comments that they've made. In other words, if an American citizen in the state of Colorado, in Denver or Colorado Springs, says something about Hong Kong or something that is addressed by the national security law of Hong Kong, and that comment is judged to be seditious or illegal, criminal, then China can literally issue an arrest warrant for an American speaking in the United States of America. That's something that I think is very problematic, to say the least. That is something that, as I would say, even the United States generally doesn't seek to go that far, and we do a lot of things in terms of extending our power and projecting our power and utilizing our power abroad. But that is a sweeping and, I would say, shocking and audacious effort to extend a jurisdictional reach. And that's another thing, among others, that are very problematic about the Hong Kong law. As a result, the United States has sanctioned Chinese officials who were involved in creating the law and implementing it. And as a result, certain measures have been taken against Hong Kong, although certainly the good people of Hong Kong are not to blame for this in any way. And now Hong Kong has become a central issue in the U.S. China relationship, and one that is going to be there for a while, because Hong Kong is a really important trading partner of the United States in its own right. Leaving aside China, Hong Kong itself has a strong and important relationship with the United States, a friendly relationship with the United States, certainly from a trade and investment standpoint, and is a major world player in international trade and international finance. And the impact of this law is going to be significant and far reaching. And now this issue is an issue in U.S. China relations, just as the issue of Hong Kong more broadly is something that people all around the world are thinking about in terms of the potential impact of this law on Hong Kong's role as a driver of economic growth, trade, and investment. So Hong Kong is out there. Third issue, trade. Obviously, since the spring of 2018, when the Trump administration implemented its policy of tariffs on incoming, what ultimately became a great swath and the great and overwhelming majority of Chinese imports into the United States, thus beginning what has been referred to as the trade war that has now been going on for over 2 years. Trade is a big issue in our relationship, to put it mildly. It is a contentious issue. There unquestionably have been asymmetries in the U.S. China trade and investment relationship that have favored China and worked to the disadvantage of the United States. Those asymmetries and really elements of unfairness are real. That is absolutely true. But the Trump administration, in its wisdom, came to the judgment that applying tariffs to incoming Chinese goods would be a good remedy for that solution. And as a result, the volume of U.S. China trade has in fact declined somewhat from well over $660 billion a year or two ago to about $550 billion today. Still a huge trading relationship, still America's third largest partner, China, that is, but not where it was a couple of years ago, because overall the amount of trade has come down predictably as a result of tariffs being imposed first by the United States and then, of course, predictably by China in response to those tariffs. And so the trade relationship remains contentious. In January of this year, the United States and China theoretically reached an agreement that was referred to as the Phase 1 trade deal that was supposed to remedy a lot of these issues. Even in the absence of COVID-19, I think there were a lot of question marks as to whether that deal was going to make much of a difference for our country. That being said, COVID-19 kind of blew that out of the water. And now the US and China are kind of mired in a moment of stagnation with respect to the trade talks. And things are not great in terms of the US-China trade relationship relative to where they had been some years ago. A little later in my talk, I'll go through an assessment of kind of using trade as an example of the efficacy or lack thereof of Trump administration policies, but I'll come back to that shortly. Here, I just want to flag that the trade issue is probably the third big issue of 2020, and really the third big issue right now in the relationship, along with COVID-19 and Hong Kong, both of which came up in emphatic ways in 2020. Another issue is that of the technological competition between the United States and China. I think when people think about the US and China being in competition with each other, probably the most specific way that the United States and China are indeed in a very intense competition is in the realm of technology, and particularly what we might refer to as the horizon technologies of things like artificial intelligence, quantum physics, 5G in terms of telecommunications networks, and a range of other issues. And in fact, China and the United States are in a very intense competition around who can gain primacy or gain the advantage in developing these cutting edge technologies that themselves open up very important areas of economic activity for the nations that are dealing with these technology issues. and have far-reaching implications for economic development, for military, and for a range of other things that countries do and other national capabilities. So there is a sense that we are in a race with China around some of these issues. And there is a sense, at least in this administration, and it's a sense that I don't know that would necessarily be a source of unanimity in Washington, but there is a sense in this administration that the United States is losing that race. And therefore, we should take certain actions to predicated on that idea and to try to level out the competition and enable the United States to compete more effectively with China. So technology, I think, is a very important theme in current U.S. China relations and the tensions that we see in our relationship. A fourth area is what I would call military and security issues, which ironically, I think in the present moment are relatively quiet compared to COVID-19, compared to Hong Kong, compared to trade, compared to technology. That said, there are some longstanding issues that fall into the military or security category, namely the South China Sea and the maritime and territorial disputes that are still very much unresolved there. And at the same time, China's relationship with Taiwan, or what's referred to as cross-strait relations, referring to the Taiwan Strait, cross-strait relations, and for that matter, the related issue of U.S. arms sales to Taiwan and U.S. relations with Taiwan. Just very recently, we had a U.S. cabinet secretary visit Taiwan in what was regarded as one of the highest level visits, or actually the highest level U.S. government visit to Taiwan in quite some time, as a kind of signal on the part of the U.S. administration that, we're going to play both sides of the strait, if you will. And so the relationship between the United States and Taiwan, and specifically our arms sales to Taiwan, remain contentious issues. Of all of the issues that we've discussed, these have been in some ways quieter than some of the other issues that I've mentioned, but they are still active issues and significant sources of divergence in perspective, policy, and actions, and they are still the source of considerable tension in the relationship. Another issue that is often discussed and that you hear about even in the context of the presidential campaign in our country is the notion of Chinese, quote, influence operations, unquote. The idea that China, in the view of some in fact, I would say many in Washington and some other quarters, that China is seeking to somehow improperly or nefariously influence our public discourse in ways that are inappropriate or problematic. And there is a concern about that type of activity. There's a lot of things that one could say, but the point that I want to make here is a couple of things. Number one, this is an active issue in the relationship. It gets a lot of attention. It gets politicians, people running for office, and those in office often comment about this. And the most immediate nexus is the idea that China, in the view of some, is seeking to use social media and other communications platforms to engage in discourse around our election and possibly to somehow unduly affect the outcome of our election. Although the allegations about Russia are far more serious and far more documented than any allegations about China, but that said, China comes up in this context. And I would say of all of the things that the United States and China have had friction over in the relationship, and of all the things that US observers have faulted China for, whether it's with respect to its performance, and I myself am on the record both in the United States and in China, both in English and in Chinese, leveling sharp criticism of China's early response to COVID-19, and many others are as well. But whatever one's views on those issues, there is some merit to US criticism of Chinese actions with respect to COVID-19, certainly with respect to Hong Kong, certainly with respect to trade and technology. Again, a lot of asymmetries in the relationship that need to be rectified and should be rectified. There certainly are legitimate concerns that the United States has about Chinese actions in the South China Sea and China's approach to Taiwan. But of all the issues, the one that I think really has not been substantiated with any evidence or any evidence of wrongdoing is the issue of quote unquote Chinese influence operations. No one has alleged, no one, not a single person, has alleged that China has done anything in this area that is illegal or that the United States itself doesn't do every single day in our own efforts to influence and inform and influence foreign publics. You know, I would also note that there is a kind of double standard as we talk about the notion of Chinese influence, and that is that when China does something aimed at influencing American discourse, we refer to it as a Chinese influence operation. When we do the same thing, we refer to it as public diplomacy. When China works with people in the United States to get across their message, some people in Washington refer to those folks that China is working with as agents of the Chinese Communist Party. And when we work with people in China to do exactly the same thing, we refer to them as our valued partners. There's a lot of language that's been created to create a kind of artificial differentiation in the area of efforts to inform and influence a foreign public. And when we do it, it's okay. And when they do it, it's not. And I think there's some hypocrisy around that. Every nation, including ours, seeks to inform and influence foreign public opinion in support of its own foreign policy objectives. We do that. Every nation does it. China does it. And there's nothing unusual about it. And there's nothing illegal about it. The only difference, however, is that when we do it in China, we are operating in a relatively closed society from a communication standpoint, a society that is a country that is a one-party state, a country that is ruled by the Communist Party of China, a country in which the media are controlled by the party, and in which the same kind of press freedoms that we enjoy in this country are not enjoyed in China. And so we're operating in a more restrictive and less permissive environment. When China operates in our country, however, they are obviously operating in a much more open environment, and one in which the First Amendment of our beloved and cherished Constitution gives people the right to speak, including diplomats of other nations. And China avails of those freedoms. And so there is an asymmetry in the context in which we're operating. But if I can editorially note, there are some in our country that, looking at this issue, have come to the judgment that we ought to be more like China in terms of restricting expression. And that type of mindset causes me a lot of concern and alarm, because I don't think we became the world's only superpower and the greatest economy in the history of the world by being closed and by not being true to our constitutional values. But this is the kind of issue that is now bouncing around and part of the U.S. China discourse. The final thing I would say, and I list it last for a very specific reason that I'll explain, is the issue of human rights. Human rights continues to be, to one degree or another, a source of certainly divergent viewpoints and contentiousness within the relationship between the United States and China. But it's also fair to say, and I think it's not in dispute, and couldn't be in dispute, that this administration has paid less attention to human rights in China than any administration in the modern history of the United States, certainly dating back to normalization. I don't think anyone would contest that. I don't think the administration would contest that. That there have been fewer comments about this topic, fewer critical comments leveled by the president or senior officials regarding Chinese human rights practices, fewer actions taken to seek to somehow improve the status quo, although obviously what we can do as Americans relative to what's happening inside China is very limited. But there's been virtually no emphasis on this issue at all in the Trump administration, and that's just a matter of record. What I would also say is, and it goes to a broader point about the notion of the difference between the reality of toughness and the perception of toughness, or the self-perception of toughness on the other, this administration would refer to itself as very tough on China. But I think it's remarkably telling that it was when this administration came into office, and not before that, that China saw the opportunity and took the opportunity to round up a very large number of Uyghur ethnic minority members of the Uyghur ethnic minority community, practicing Muslims, and to round them up and to place them into, quote, re-educational or, quote, vocational camps, labor camps, indoctrination camps in Western China, and to do that on a massive scale. To me, it is telling that China didn't do that under President Trump's predecessor, but chose to do that only a few months after President Trump became president of the United States. One can speculate as to why China may have decided on that timing. And that's a matter of speculation, and that's a matter of opinion. What's not a matter of opinion, and what is a matter of empirical fact, is that China didn't do that when President Obama was president, but they did do it when President Trump was president. That's, I think, emblematic of what I referred to as a kind of underemphasis, if you will, in the United States today, in this administration, on the important issue of human rights. Let me shift to a couple of other points that I want to make. I want to just keep an eye on the time here. And say a little bit about, and I've kind of foreshadowed this a little bit, about my assessment of the Trump administration's approach to China. And before I do that, let me make this comment. When I refer to the Trump administration, I want to be fair. Part of it is the Trump administration, but part of it is also the United States Congress, which is certainly not the Trump administration. I think the Trump administration coming in as the new administration in January of 2017 certainly set the tone in Washington on China, as it sought to do during the campaign. But that tonality and that sense of perception, that change in perception with respect to China, has seeped out of the executive branch of the US government and into Congress and across Washington generally, and across our country to a large degree. So when I say the Trump administration, a good synonym would also be the official Washington, or kind of the DC policymakers, Washington policymakers, et cetera. But I'll use the term Trump administration for short, because it is true of the Trump administration, and they really set the tone on this particular policy issue. So how effective has this Trump administration / official Washington approach to China been so far? The answer to that question, in my personal estimation, and I think an estimation shared by a good number of other people that have looked at this closely, is that the policies have actually been very ineffectual and very bad for America in a number of very specific and identifiable ways. And I want to talk a little bit about that. A lot of damage has been done to the U.S. China relationship and to our ability to work with China on a host of issues that are very important to the United States and to the American people. A lot of that damage is intangible and hard to quantify, but it's no less real. But here, let me make a point, just for purposes of being very clear, and use the example of trade to cite some things that are quantifiable and that go to the assertion that I just made, and that I think substantiate factually the assertion that I just made, that the Trump approach and Washington's approach to China is not working well for our country. So let me cite a few data points with respect to the issue of U.S. China trade. As I mentioned earlier, the Trump administration saw fit to implement tariffs on virtually all Chinese, incoming Chinese imports into the United States. And predictably, China, in a tit-for-tat measure, essentially mirrored all of those tariffs with respect to its imports of US goods into China. As a result of that, as I noted, overall trade volume has gone down. But here's an interesting question. What other effects have these policies had? And specifically, what effect on the US deficit with China the deficit that the tariffs were supposed to remedy, what effect have these policies had on those deficits? Well, here's the data. And all of this data is from the Trump administration. It's official US government Trump administration data on the public record, publicly available. And here's what it says, that the US merchandise deficit with China today is near the very top level that it has ever been in American history. We have a larger deficit today as a result of these policies, merchandise deficit with China, than we did 3.5 years ago. In fact, we set the record for U.S. merchandise deficit with China a couple of years ago, 2018, as a direct result of these policies. And the average annual U.S. merchandise deficit with China during this entire presidency exceeds that of all previous US presidents in history. So we have gone the wrong direction according to Trump administration data on deficits. We have a larger deficit today with China than we did on the day that President Trump took the oath of office. That's one data point. Second data point, the US has a larger deficit with the world in merchandise, a larger merchandise deficit with the world than we have ever had since July 4th, 1776. The largest merchandise deficit with the world in our history. We also, under this president, have had the second largest merchandise deficit with the world in our nation's history. So our deficit with the world is also going up, and that is also a matter of factual record based on Trump administration data. Third data point, we are losing manufacturing jobs, not gaining them. And of course, Trump's stated that these policies are designed to bring manufacturing back to the United States. Well, guess what? We're losing manufacturing. And the reason for that is when you make inputs that factories need to make their products, many of those inputs come from all over the world, including China, but including other countries as well. When those inputs become more expensive, the good that you're producing at that US factory becomes more expensive. When the good that you're producing at the US factory becomes more expensive, what do you think happens to the demand for that good? You're right, it goes down. When the demand goes down, what do you think happens to the workers who are producing that product at that factory? Yeah, they get the pink slip. And that's exactly what's happened in this country under these policies. When you make American goods more expensive by making the inputs necessary to make those goods more expensive, you kill American jobs. And that is exactly what has happened over the last 3.5 years, entirely predictably, by the way. Let's talk about farmers. What's happened there? President Trump saw fit to basically say to American farmers, by virtue of his tariff policies, by placing tariffs on Chinese goods coming in, China placed tariffs on US goods, including agricultural goods going out. That hit farmers hard. The overwhelming majority of the farming community felt that the sting of those policies and the sting of the impacts of those policies. And as a result, American farmers were not able to sell their commodities to China in the way that they had been before. To cushion the blow of that very harsh reality, the administration made available to farmers some $28 billion in federal subsidies to partially offset the greater amount of money that they would have made had they simply been allowed to sell their products to China as they had been before. Another way to say what I just said is that the Trump administration is paying American farmers an income they don't want and don't need with money our nation doesn't have. If that's not a great definition of old school socialism, I don't know what is. But we've got an administration that would rather give a government handout with borrowed money to farmers that they won't allow to sell on the market to China, and for that matter to other countries. It is bad for farmers, it is bad for our heartland, and it has resulted in something that I never thought I would see happen, and that is the transformation of an American surplus in agricultural trade with China into today, as we sit here right now, an agricultural deficit with China as a result of these policies. Trump inherited a surplus. The one area in our in the U.S. China trade relationship of goods, of merchandise or commodities, in which we had a surplus. And through his policies, he has transformed it into another area of deficit, which is one of the reasons we have a larger deficit with China than we did on the day that President Trump took office. All of this data is from the Trump administration. The final thing I would say is that all of us have had our taxes raised by virtue of these tariffs, albeit in a different, by other means, if you will. And the way that our taxes have been raised is when you apply a tariff to an incoming good, the individual or the entity that is importing that good pays that tax. A tariff is a tax. President Trump has raised taxes. That's exactly what he's done with respect to tariffs. He has raised taxes and put in place taxes that didn't exist before he put them there. As a result of that, those costs are handed down to consumers, and nonpartisan studies that are respected across both sides of the aisle have stated that the average American household is paying between $800 and $1,500 more per year for goods that they were able to get far less expensively last year or 2 years ago. To someone making $300,000 or $400,000 or $500,000 a year, you may not notice that. If you're making $35,000 or $40,000 a year in your household, or $50,000, and you think about what you bring home after taxes, being out of pocket an additional $800, $1,000, $1,500 is something you do notice. It creates a situation where you have to start making difficult choices between things that you'd like to have but can't afford. And that's the hit that every American household is borne, according to nonpartisan data, because of the tariffs. This is an example. It's one of a number that I could cite, but it's the one that is most quantifiable and fact-based. Again, I admit it, folks, I'm old-fashioned. I believe that if you say something, you ought to have a factual foundation for the assertion that you're making. That's just me. I know that that's not the norm in some quarters in this country, but every statement I made is a factual statement, backed up by data, and not only that, backed up by data from this administration. This is an example of where these policies are failing to serve our nation and our people. And that's why I come to the judgment that these policies are bad for our country and that they are failing us. Let me make a couple of other points before I conclude here shortly, and I'll leave a good amount of time for your questions because I really value that. Why has this administration's and Washington's approach to China gone so off course, with, again, the trade data, factual empirical data being a good example of the ways that it's gone off course, and done exactly the opposite of what it was expected or hoped to do? Why? Why has that happened? And I think there are two basic reasons for that. Number one is that the policies that this administration and official Washington, including the U.S. Congress, but especially the administration, have put in place have been predicated on incorrect assumptions and factually false foundations. And when the assumptions that go into formulating your policy are inaccurate, your policy is going to veer off course. And when the factual foundation that you're relying on to form policy is flawed and in fact is not factual, then your policy once again is going to veer off course. And that is exactly what we've seen happen in the case of U.S. policy toward China in a number of ways, but not least and most obviously in the case of trade and investment relations with China. What are, in my judgment, the two major misjudgments? Let me give you examples of each: flawed assumptions, flawed facts. And I'll try to be brief here. I think the Trump administration has made a couple of fundamentally flawed judgments, and these are judgments, but I believe they're erroneous judgments about China that has caused the administration to adopt a set of policies that aren't solving the problems that we actually face. And the fundamental misreadings of China, I think, are twofold. And there are other things one could say, but let me boil it down to two. Number one, I think this administration believes that China seeks to create a bunch of authoritarian regimes across the face of the globe, and that China would like to create a lot of governments that look a lot like the government of the People's Republic of China. One party state, not the same political values that we have, et cetera, et cetera. And I think the Trump administration believes that that's what China is seeking to do. I think the Trump administration also believes that China seeks to displace the United States and supplant the United States as the world's only superpower in the sense of the term that we mean it. And that China would like to become the United States 2.0 in terms of its ability to project power across the globe, to put boots on the ground in a whole variety of places around the world, and to be the world policeman and so forth and so on. I believe that both of these understandings of China that are evidenced by the Trump administration and spoken about by Trump administration officials are erroneous. China has ambitions, but not these ambitions. Begs the question, well, what does China want? Well, China wants a lot of things, but fundamentally, I think what it wants is to be a relatively more co-equal player in the world and a more co-equal source of power relative to the United States, relative to Japan, relative to Europe as a whole, relative to Russia, and other major poles or players within the global system. But in my judgment, it is absolutely wrong, dead wrong, to think that China wants to be the United States 2.0 that puts boots on the ground in Iraq, boots on the ground in Afghanistan, boots on the ground in Grenada, boots on the ground in Panama, or any number of other places around the world, and that to have hundreds or thousands of military bases, to be the world policeman, to go into countries unilaterally when they think it's appropriate. That is not what China wants. It doesn't want that for many reasons, but not least because it costs lives and it costs a lot of money, and it gets you embroiled into a lot of things that China doesn't want to be embroiled in. So to believe that China wants that and to project our American mindset, our nation's mindset around these issues, and our nation's desire for supremacy and primacy, and that's a doctrinal desire that we've had for a number of administrations, and bipartisan, dating back several decades. To assume that that is true for China is a fundamental misreading of China. China wants to be to create a less of a gap in its overall national capacity and power relative to the United States, but it does not want to perform the duties that the United States has taken upon itself in recent decades, and basically since World War II. And that is a fundamental misassessment, in my judgment, of China's strategic intentions. And it has led us down a policy course, along with other misassessments, that has caused us to adopt policies that aren't working. And we wonder why they're not working. They're not working because they're predicated in premises and understandings that are inaccurate. Let me give you an example of one fact-based premise that is incorrect. And it's one very specific thing, but it's a very telling example of why our policies are not having the desired results. President Trump has said scores of times, 40, 50, 60, I've lost count, scores of times on the record, in statements from the White House, from the Oval Office, on Twitter, and so on, that China is paying the tariffs that he has levied against Chinese imports into the United States. That statement is empirically, factually false. That is absolutely, unequivocally not true. We are paying those tariffs by definition. The importer pays the tariff. You are tariffing the importer, not the exporter. That is very fundamentally just the way it is. And yet President Trump has repeatedly stated that China is paying the tariffs. Now, what does that mean in terms of the point that I'm trying to make? It means that when you're the president and you believe, and you really believe, that China is paying for the tariffs, then you are going to gravitate toward having tariffs, because after all, it's China that's paying for them, not us. This is a case where being factually wrong about something leads to a policy choice that is bad for America. Because when you believe that we're not paying the tariffs, then the more tariffs, the better. And as a matter of fact, I would pose this question just to drive the point home. If the president of the United States believes that China is paying the tariffs, then why limit the tariffs to 15%? Why not have the tariffs be 10 million%? Why not have them be 1 billion%? If China's paying the tariffs and that money is flowing from China into our treasury, then why not make the tariffs higher? We're not paying them. Well, we are paying them. And this is where facts actually matter. And having a fact-based understanding of policy makes a difference when it comes to making policy choices. So this is why, in my judgment, we have veered so off course and generated so many results that are not what this president said that he wanted. And again, I never judge President Trump because he's failed to attain David Firestein's stated policy objectives. I only hold him accountable for failing to attain his own stated policy objectives, and that he has done in spades. Let me make a couple of points before I can briefly reference U.S. politics, and then I'll conclude. And I'm mostly done now. Just give me a few minutes to finish up here. I've talked about the impact of being factually wrong in your understanding of a policy on policy. When you're wrong in your understanding, when your understanding is flawed, the policy will not do what you expect it to do. I want to make a broader point here that's not just specific to China or to the Trump administration or any party, but I want to just say this because I think it needs to be said. It needs to be said more and more by more of us, and I believe it's true. And I believe when you hear this statement, you will understand the truth of it. And that is that the untethering of our public discourse from factual reality is the single most fundamental threat to our nation's security and prosperity that we face. And I don't make that as a partisan point or a Trump point. I make that as a point about our politics in general. The untethering of our discourse from factual reality is the most profound threat that we face as a nation today. Why? Because if we can't discuss public policy in a fact-based way, then we will never solve the nation's public policy challenges, because the challenges are fact-based. If the solutions aren't fact-based, we will never solve the challenges. And I think that's something we shouldn't lose sight of as a nation. And we should hold our elected leadership of either party across the partisan aisle accountable to be fact-based and to make decisions based on fact in the interest of our nation. Let me say, with that segue, just a few words about how China's playing in the election, and then I'll come to a conclusion here. I'm looking at the time. I know I've gone a little long. Let me kind of distill this down. Official Washington views China today very differently than it did three and a half years ago. That is true. That is true across the partisan aisle. Overall, Washington is vastly more negative toward China than it was some years ago. A lot of the legislation that has passed the United States Congress relative to China, China-focused legislation, has passed not only with bipartisan support, but in a number of cases, literally with unanimous support, meaning literally 535 to 0, okay, the two houses of Congress. You don't see that much anymore in this country, but you see it around China issues not infrequently. So there is a bipartisan consensus evidently and very clearly that the United States needs to approach China in a way that's different than the way we'd approached China previously as a nation. That being said, are there any partisan divides between the United States, between the Republican Party and the Democratic Party? And the answer is yes. And let me give you one example of a rhetorical distinction and one example of a policy distinction, and then I'll conclude. Rhetorically, it is unquestionably true that the Republican Party is making China a bigger issue in an electoral sense than the Democratic Party is. No question about that. All you have to do is look at the two national conventions, which I watched cover to cover, as I always do, and look at the transcripts, and you could even do a word count. China was mentioned rather sparingly on the Democratic side, and there wasn't a lot of very robust criticism of China from any major speaker in the convention, and I watched every one of them. On the Republican side, and I watched every one of those as well, there was a lot of very direct and frontal criticism, very harsh criticism, even to the point where a former Chinese dissident, now resident in the United States, spoke at the convention and called the Communist Party of China, quote, an enemy of humanity, as I noted earlier. And the president certainly used a lot of tough language, as did Secretary Pompeo, as did many others. So there is a very significant and clear distinction between the parties with respect to the degree to which one party versus the other is really talking about China and trying to make China a central campaign issue. That's one distinction. That's at the rhetorical level. And by the way, let me also note, Republicans send out a lot of fundraising messages, and they get forwarded to me all the time, saying, I'm going to be tough on China, but to do that, I need your help. Please donate to my campaign so that I can give voice to getting tough on China in the halls of Congress, et cetera. I have yet to see a single Democrat make that pitch from a fundraising standpoint. They make other pitches, but every one of the pitches I've seen around China for campaign fundraising is from Republicans, and that's emblematic of what I just talked about. The policy distinction is that the Republican Party, and there really, I think, is only one major distinction on policy, but it's an important one. And that is that the Republican Party is the pro-tariff party. They are the pro-tariff party. They are for the tariffs, even though the tariffs are hurting shareholders, managers, workers, farmers, ranchers. But as I said before once, other than that, it's a great policy. The point that I would make, this is where we are. We're for this. We're for these policies. And President Trump himself has referred to himself in his own language, his own tweet, as, quote, tariff man. That's his words about himself. I wouldn't say that unless he himself had said it about himself. So the self-proclaimed tariff man and the Republican Party embrace tariffs. The Democrats do not. And Joe Biden has said that if he's elected president, that he will get rid of the tariffs because they are, for several reasons, they are killing manufacturing jobs, they are driving up our deficit, they are creating hardships for American farmers and creating the first agricultural deficit we've had in the modern history of the United States with China. And they are a tax on all of us, every single one of us sitting here. They're a tax on all of us in terms of prices that we pay at Walmart, Target, and many other stores. That's why he's against them. And so there is a major difference around that issue. Pretty much everything else, I'm not sure there's a discernible distinction, but on the issue of trade and tariffs, there is a discernible distinction. And so we'll see what happens in November. We also should be cognizant that public opinion is a big part of the mix. And the rhetoric drives the opinion, the opinion enables the rhetoric, and there's a mutually reinforcing and self-perpetuating dynamic there. To conclude, let me just say that I think things are going to get worse before they get worse. I think they're going to get worse before they get better. China will be a really significant theme of the last 60 days of this election that are now upon us. It's hard to say what's going to happen after November. To some degree, it hinges on who wins. And I think that's very much a toss-up at this point. But even then, I think even if Joe Biden were to win the presidency, I don't think we would see a sea change in Washington's thinking about China in January, but we would start to see some significant differences in policy, particularly around tariffs. And of course, you would see a very different style of presidential communication as a stylistic matter as well. That being said, it's going to be an ugly 60 days when it comes to the topic of China, because this is going to be a hotly contested, it is and will continue to be a hotly contested race, and China is going to figure in it prominently. Final sentence I want to say is this. Unquestionably, China is the most formidable national the United States will ever face of every living American, every American alive today, including an infant that's just born at this moment. No question about that. That said, in my judgment, turning China into an enemy that it didn't have to be would be the grandest strategic blunder that the United States has ever made if that were to happen. And for the sake of our country and for the sake of future generations, I fervently hope and pray that the United States is able to avoid that outcome. And we at the George H.W. Bush Foundation for U.S. China Relations and many allies across the country are going to do everything in our power to help our nation from going off, to help prevent our nation from going off that cliff. With that, I want to thank everyone for your time and for being a part of this, and I look forward to your comments and your questions. Thank you. And yeah, thank you. Karen, I don't know if we have moderated questions or if I'm supposed to just look at Q&A, but just someone let me know what I should do and I will do it.
So, okay, you can hear me now. Yes, I'm happy to read these questions, and I'm also going to be taking live questions from the people who are attending here. So I'll just start with the first two because we do have several written ones. So firstly, what jurisdiction does China have to enforce its Hong Kong sedition laws in the United States? And then the second question from Walter Shaw is asking, where does Taiwan fit into the People's Republic of China / Hong Kong issue?
Those are great questions. Let me address both of those. First of all, China is making the claim via this law that is now on the books and in force that it will hold criminally liable anyone anywhere in the world who makes comments that it regards as going afoul of this law. However, its ability to enforce that is very limited. So if someone stands up in the great state of Colorado and says something about Hong Kong that the Chinese authorities, in their judgment, assess to be, quote, criminal in nature, in other words, the statement is a violation of the national security law of Hong Kong, then China certainly can issue an arrest warrant, but needless to say, it would have no way of acting upon that warrant or executing that warrant so long as the individual in question doesn't somehow end up within China's jurisdiction physically. And so if that individual makes the statement and somehow is deemed to have violated the law and then flies to China, that could very well be enforced and probably would be enforced. And China would be within its rights, within its own sovereign boundaries, to enforce laws, even those that we think are wrong and that we disagree with. It would certainly have the ability to enforce an arrest warrant, place someone under arrest, place them on trial, and potentially find them guilty of a crime. So, to the question, if someone stands here in this country and makes any comment that they wish to make pursuant to their First Amendment rights that we cherish in this nation, then they can do that. And as long as they're never going to China, the reality is they will never, I think it's fair to say, they will never have to be held criminally liable in any specifics, in any physical sense. They're not going to be arrested. They're not going to be tried. They're not going to be thrown in jail as long as they don't wind up in that jurisdiction. But if they wind up in that jurisdiction, then that's a whole different ballgame. So China's ability to enforce this law outside of its borders is extremely limited to nil. But it does create these situations where there is risk depending on the travels of the individual. And to the second question with respect to Taiwan, I think it's another great question, and I would say this. Something that my friends in China sometimes don't fully understand is that Taiwan looks at Hong Kong as, and even before the national security law in recent years, and I testified on Capitol Hill about this very phenomenon and have written about it, talked about it many times over the years publicly. China looks at, let me say it this way, China looks at Hong Kong and has historically and says to Taiwan, look, one country, two systems can work. It works in Hong Kong. Don't you in Taiwan want to have this same wonderful arrangement that Hong Kong has? That's China's perspective. What China has often not understood, and Chinese leaders and others have not understood, is that Taiwan looks at Hong Kong and sees exactly the opposite. Exactly, they look at Hong Kong and see something that they would never want. And that disconnect is emblematic of a very fundamental difference of perspective between the mainland on the one hand and Taiwan on the other. And certainly the national security law that was just passed and put into force in Hong Kong a couple of months ago just makes all the more emphatic the point that many in Taiwan have made, which is that the Hong Kong model is not for us. And now this is a really profoundly important example of exactly why that's so in the minds of those in Taiwan. The notion of the mainland government and the party and the powers that be in the mainland essentially coercing Hong Kong to adopt a law that represents a major change from the way that things were done in Hong Kong prior to the advent of the law. That is not something that there is any appetite for in Taiwan whatsoever. And so the short answer to the question is Taiwan looks at Hong Kong and did even before the national security law and does even more so now that this law is on the books and says that is not what we want. That's exactly why we don't want so-called one country, two systems. And so I think that what has happened in Hong Kong over the last couple of months and in recent years, but particularly over the last couple of months with the adoption of the national security law, pushes Taiwan further away and makes China's own stated objective of reunification much more difficult to attain. And I think the cascading impacts of that are going to play out over some period of time. But that is clearly the effect in my judgment.
Okay, thank you. Next question. While the U.S. is busy harming our relations with European nations, does China's Belt and Road and European initiatives present a serious long-term risk to the United States? And then I'm going to skip down to another question also related to China's Silk Road. Would you comment on China's Silk Road initiatives vis-a-vis both Africa and South America and the significance of this politically and economically?
Well, so the Belt and Road Initiative is basically China's effort to look west, both over land and over water, to create through a set of policies in terms of economic development and trade and development generally, and to a certain degree political policies, but it's mostly kind of an economic development strategy. The idea is to put it simply, is to build out the West, the West relative to China, which is relatively underdeveloped. A lot of the developing world is to China's west, whether it's in Central Asia, South Asia, and over to the eastern part of Africa, into the Caucasus in terms of Europe, and even into Eastern Europe. China's idea is to turn those relatively underdeveloped places into potential markets for Chinese goods and services, and to help them develop, to help them gain capacity economically and from a trade standpoint and from a technology standpoint, so that, stated from China's perspective, they can become consumers of Chinese goods and services at such time as their countries get a certain degree of liftoff. A lot of people in the United States and elsewhere, but not, I would say not everyone, but a lot of people look at that and see a kind of nefarious or sinister intent, global domination and trying to put these countries somehow under the thumb of China and make them beholden to China. There are probably elements of that are part of this overall equation, but it's not too dissimilar from the notion of the United States reaching out all around the world and creating development programs in Africa, Latin America, South Asia, Southeast Asia, and various other parts of the developing world, and then expecting certain things in return. The thing that I just don't have a lot of tolerance for is hypocrisy. And I think that we often judge China's actions by a different standard than we judge our own. And, you know, when China does something wrong, we should call it out. And China often does things that I think and that I think our nation thinks are wrong. I think we also often do things that are wrong, and I think we also are under an obligation to call that out. But there are those that view China's Belt and Road Initiative, and this goes to the second question as well, as somehow challenging or problematic or nefarious or sinister. I just see it as China seeking to engage in global competition, to be a presence in the world to a greater degree than it has been, to be a trading partner in the world to a greater degree than it has been with some of these countries. And it already is in the top three of, I think it's the top trading partner of 2/3 of the countries in the world already. But it wants to build out. I don't think there's anything inherently illegitimate about that aspiration. To the extent that China adopts approaches or specific policies that are that bully other nations or that coerce other nations or that do things that are illegal or that are a violation of China's international commitments, then that's problematic. That should be called out. And the United States should react as it sees fit. But at a conceptual level, the notion of trying to build out trade routes is not something that is any different than any number of other nations have done or continue to do. And I think what we need to do as a nation is to put our best foot forward in terms of our own ability to trade, to export, to assist with the development of developing nations, to build friendships and alliances around the world, to not alienate our allies, as was I think implicitly referenced in the first question. And the one thing that we can control is our own performance. And so I think we need to be aware of what China's doing, but I think we need to focus on the thing that we can control, which is our own national performance, and making ourselves the better choice. If we want to compete, and we should want to compete, and we should want to win, if we want to compete and win, the way we do that is by making ourselves the clear, better choice. That's what we haven't focused on enough. And China is focusing on it, and I think we need to focus on it every bit as much as China does.
Okay, thank you. Another question from Pavel Kozhevnikov, who is at UCCS. Thank you for this interesting conversation. My question is about Russian and Chinese interference in our elections. Don't we interfere in their elections? And how come they can change the minds of millions of Americans to vote or not to vote for Trump or Biden?
Yeah, it's a great question. I have to say, let me make 2 points. Number one, there is a real body of evidence that Russia is engaging in actions that are designed to shape election-related discourse in this country. I still don't really, and there were certainly the assertion is that Russia did that in 2016, and if the U.S. intelligence community unanimously states that, then I'm prepared to accept that. What I don't really understand is exactly what you just referenced in your question, which is there is already so much vitriol and nastiness in our politics, and so much virulent disagreement, and so much spreading of falsehoods and conspiracy theories and so forth and so on, that to me personally, and having worked in Russia and worked in China, I speak Russian, I speak Chinese, I lived in Moscow 4 years, I know that country quite well, and I'm not unfamiliar with the topic of U.S. Russia relations and so on. But the thing that I don't get is how anything that some folks sitting in some basement in Moscow or St. Petersburg might be churning out on Facebook or on Twitter or whatever, how that is going to have any discernible impact on the choice that the American electorate as a whole makes, when we already organically are divided and in many ways nasty toward each other across the partisan aisle, and the gloves are off. The idea that somehow that's going to make a difference in our race, our presidential race, and the outcome of the presidential race, I just don't buy that. I don't see any specific evidence that's ever been put on the table that that is so. And I think it's implausible. And that's Russia. And I grant that Russia has done stuff in this area. But what the distinction between Russia and China is that no one has put evidence on the table that China has done anything like what the Russians have done in terms of scale or the nature of the activities. I don't think anyone's alleged that any of the actual communication that Russians are engaging in or allegedly engaging in is even illegal. Where Russians have violated the law is on visa fraud, abusing the post office services or whatever they call that, postal fraud, mail fraud. That no one is challenging the legality of their communications. They're challenging the legality of some of these other auxiliary actions that are associated with it. But no one has even made those allegations about China. So, are there bloggers, are there people, in China that are weighing in on Facebook or Twitter trying to somehow shape the election and the outcome of the election in one direction or the other? Maybe there are, but the notion that that's going to have any significant effect on the outcome of our election, I think, is pretty far-fetched. We have much more profound problems in this country within our own discourse between the two parties. Worrying about what some folks are saying on social media against the backdrop of an electorate that is already bitterly and virulently divided, I just don't see that that's an issue that is really the thing that we should be worried about the most in terms of this election. And to your point, to the point of the question, yes, the United States has been involved in foreign elections many times over the years, and not least in the case of Russia in 1996, when U.S. political consultants helped Boris Yeltsin come from behind against Gennady Zyuganov, the Communist Party candidate for president, who was leading decisively. And the United States very much, let's put it this way, U.S. citizens, and I think with the blessing of the U.S. government, weighed in favor of Boris Yeltsin and helped him get reelected. And that's one example among many, both overt and covert efforts that the United States has made historically, and we've all read about them in the history books. So yes, for us to sit in judgment of people commenting on our electoral process is a bit hypocritical when we've done things much more egregious than that relative to the political processes of many other nations. Absolutely no question about it. And let me come back to this last point, and that is that no one is even alleging, let alone substantiating or providing evidence to support the assertion that any of the actual communication is illegal. The communication is legal, and the reason it's legal is because it is protected by the First Amendment of the United States Constitution. If somebody wants to come on Facebook, whether they're from China or the Netherlands or Russia or Mexico or Canada or Iowa, and say, I don't like Trump, I think he's a terrible guy, or I don't like Biden, I think he's a terrible guy, they have every right to do that. And this is one of those problems where any solution to this problem would be vastly worse than the problem. And I sure as heck, as someone in this country who has taken a sworn oath to protect the United States Constitution, when I was a US diplomat, one of the proudest moments of my life. As someone who's taken an oath to protect the Constitution, I sure as heck we hope we don't go down the road of trying to curtail our First Amendment because of what some people in Russia or China or Iran or anywhere else are saying on Twitter about our presidential election. It's hard to even say it with a straight face.
I have two questions here that deal with previous policy and actions regarding bad behavior on the part of China. So I'll read them both and maybe you could address them both. Until Trump came in, had there been any progress in protecting U.S. intellectual property rights, presumably through negotiation? And then the second question is, what has been tried in the past to correct the inequities China has created, such as international monetary manipulations, stealing state and industrial data, South China Sea issues, Hong Kong promises violation, unfair trade surpluses, infringing upon fishing rights in the Pacific, plus many other issues? And has not China, to a large extent, created this chaos?
These are really good questions. And so let me address them head on. And I recognize we may go a little bit over the appointed 90 minutes, but if that's with the permission of Karen and all of you, I'll say a few things. And I'm happy to stay on a little longer as well. But let me give those the answers they deserve. To the first question, the issue of IPR, yes, efforts were, I think the question was any progress made in previous administrations prior to the Trump administration on IPR? Efforts were made, little progress was made. Under the Trump administration, efforts have been made and very little progress has been made. So efforts have been made by every administration dating back basically to Bill Clinton when these issues really surfaced. I was one of the interpreters for the US delegations during 1995 and 1996 when Charlene Barshevsky was the US trade representative under President Clinton. And I interpreted a significant swath of the initial major US-China IPR talks and was present for many hours of those talks in that capacity. These issues have been on the agenda for nearly a quarter of a century. Every administration has sought to do something about Chinese IPR theft, which is a serious problem and has been and continues to be. Some progress has been made, but not much in the grand scheme of things. And that is also true in this administration. Every administration tries, and every administration generally has been less than fully successful, including this one, but also previous administrations, in getting their arms around the issue of intellectual property rights. So it is true that the Trump administration is trying to address the issue. It is absolutely, the jury is absolutely still out as to what the long-term effects of these efforts and the long-term results of these efforts are going to be. So that would be my answer to that question is it's a tough nut to crack. And I think the thing that I would say here before shifting over to the other point, and I want to come back to that, I may need a bit of a reminder on the initial language of that question, but I remember the long laundry list and the essence of the question. But let me just say, the corporate sector of our country, whether it's high-tech entities like Apple or retailers like Walmart or computer companies like Dell or anybody else, and hundreds, thousands of US companies, huge, big, medium, and small, have dealt with China for decades. And the collective judgment that these companies have made is whatever the problems are with respect to intellectual property, it's still worth being in the market because obviously they're still making money being in the market. And they still have generally supported an approach to China that favors relatively free trade and flows of investment and so on because they've judged that to be in their interest. What the Trump administration fundamentally is saying, and by the way, one can agree or disagree with those corporate policies, but certainly the one half of American households that have held shares of companies like Dell or Apple or Walmart through 401ks and through mutual funds and direct stock ownership, and half of America owns equities. Certainly, those folks have benefited financially from the fact that those companies have stayed engaged. So I think what this administration has done that's different from previous administrations is saying, instead of letting companies make those decisions based on the corporate merits and to be answerable to shareholders, we, the Trump administration, are now going to make these decisions for you and tell you what to do and where to be and whether to enter the market or not enter the market. And we're going to ask you, we, the Trump administration, are going to ask you, corporate America, to do your patriotic duty and to serve the nation, rather in the way that we, the Trump administration, define it, rather than to serve your shareholders. Well, you know where I've heard that before? China. China tells its companies, we want you to serve the nation rather than putting the interests of your shareholders first. This is what I mean when I say we're emulating China's worst practices as best practices to be copied and emulated in ways that take us away from what we're all about as a nation, what we always have been about, which is the market. Now, to the second question, here's what I want to say. And there was a long laundry list of issues, and I understand the essence of the question. Let me say this. China does an awful lot of things that are really problematic for our country, as viewed from an American perspective, and certainly from a U.S. government perspective. No question about that. They do things that we think are wrong. They do things that we judge to be inimical to our interests and antithetical to our interests. They do things that are very problematic for our companies and in some cases, for our national security. And China should be taken to task for all of those things. We also do things that from China's vantage point are very problematic, and they certainly believe that they should take us to task for doing some of those things. For example, selling arms to Taiwan, something that I support, something that our government supports, but China doesn't like it, thinks that we shouldn't do it, thinks that we're wrong to do it, and they have a problem with that, and they have a problem with any number of other things that we do. But certainly stated from an American perspective, yes, of course, China does an awful lot of things that are very, very problematic for our nation. No question about it. China, in some regards, is a rule breaker in the international system, whether it's with respect to WTO, World Trade Organization rules, UN Universal Declaration on Human Rights. One could go down the list. And by the way, we're no angel either. We've broken a lot of rules. We've done a lot of things in violation of international norms and international law. We've made those choices. Sometimes those choices maybe have been the right choices to make. But I don't want us to think we should sit up on the high hill of judgment of everyone else and not recognize that we too have done things the way we've wanted to do them oftentimes as well. That all being said, let me make this point. Is China responsible to a very large degree for the mess that the U.S. China relationship is in at this time? Absolutely, yes. Absolutely, unequivocally, yes, of course. We have our share of the responsibility as well, but China has plenty of responsibility for being part of how we got to where we are. I absolutely endorse that view. But here's the thing. What previous administrations have had that this administration, I think, lacks is the wisdom to understand when they didn't have the ability to create a solution to a problem that was better than the problem. So take the example of trade. And it bears on the first question about IPR. President Clinton tried to address this issue. President George W. Bush tried to address this issue. President Obama tried to address this issue. And now President Trump is trying to address it. In the 24 years of Clinton, George W. Bush, and Obama, the cumulative conclusion that was made by each of those presidents representing both of our major parties was that they couldn't think of a solution to the problem of IPR theft or to the problem of the trade imbalances that wasn't worse than the problem. The Trump administration came in January 2017, and came in and said, we're going to come up with a solution to the issue of imbalances referenced in the question in the U.S. China trade relationship. Well, they came up with a solution. The problem is the solution is worse than the problem, which is why we have the largest merchandise deficit with China that we've ever had, the largest merchandise deficit with the world that we've ever had, declining manufacturing jobs, farmers losing their farms, and Americans paying about $1,000 more at Walmart and Target than we did 2 years ago. If that is this administration's definition of winning, then President Trump and candidate Trump was right. I am tired of winning. And I think a lot of Americans are tired of winning if that's the definition. Sometimes the greatest wisdom that a policymaker can have is understanding that he or she doesn't have the sufficient wisdom to solve the problem and generate a status quo that is better than the prior status quo. And what we've seen in this case is that that has played out. And it's played out in ways that hurt our country. So does China bear a substantial share of responsibility for the souring of U.S. China relations? Absolutely, emphatically, yes. But do we bear, as a nation and this administration, and our Congress, bear a substantial responsibility for shooting ourselves in our own foot and making what was a bad situation worse? Unquestionably, we do.
All right, we're going to go to a live question here, and then unfortunately there are some wonderful questions here. I wish that we could get all of them in, but I think we'd be here for quite a while. Perhaps, David, you and I can talk offline about maybe addressing some of these other things in another manner, but so I'm going to turn this over to Jim Allen.
Thank you.
Thank you. Appreciate your comments. They were complete and insightful. I have what I think is an important question, so I hope I can describe it properly for you. It has to do with the financial strength of China going forward. Let me describe that just a little bit. If you describe the belt, you mentioned the Belt and Road, that's going to be expensive for China. If you look at Venezuela, they came in after Hugo Chavez nationalized the oil industry down there and throughout ExxonMobil and the others. China came in and put in $10 billion and maybe now another $10 billion in Venezuela. Look at the Blue Nile in the Horn of Africa. I think it's Ethiopia. They just finished building that dam, $7, $8, $10 billion. They may be not going to get a return on that money very fast. And then when you look at inside China, they have healthcare costs as the nation's population ages and pension costs that they have to support. So my question is, will the financial realities and strains on China become great enough that they won't go bankrupt literally because they can print money until health freezes over, I guess. But they have the financial thing will begin to pinch on them. They're not getting a return on those investments I gave you the examples of. So that will restrain them from being quite as aggressive in the military sense or in expansion or expanding Belt and Road or whatever it is. That will affect our foreign policy and, of course, their foreign policy going forward. So how likely is it that the financial situation that that country will face domestically to meet their own internal needs, will that hold them back from being more of a threat and change our foreign policy towards China?
It's a really great question. And I'm going to address that directly here, but let me say one thing first, because your question, sir, reminds me of something that I really should have flagged in an earlier response. And it relates to the issue of finances. And then I'll come directly to your point. And that is that with respect to the U.S. administration's subsidies for farmers, the perverse irony within the broader irony of that policy is that we're paying farmers a subsidy while we have a deficit of $3 or $4 trillion this year. Obviously, COVID-19 struck a major blow to the U.S. economy and tax revenues and so on. We're paying farmers with a government handout that is funded by China because we're borrowing from China about a quarter of all the debt that we have, or not a quarter of it, a very high percentage of the foreign debt that we have, and the largest single foreign creditor to the United States at about $1 trillion in outstanding debt is China. So we're denying farmers the opportunity to sell to China, but we're borrowing from China to pay them with money that we're going to have to pay back to China, except that we don't know how we're going to do that because we have a multi-trillion-dollar federal deficit. And we're worried about China. And the point that I'm making is we can't get our own house in order. But let me come to your question. You're absolutely right that China has some very ambitious programs, whether it's Belt and Road, whether it's space, whether it's, frankly, internal security, the military, the economy. And it is the second largest economy in the world. It is relatively fast growing economy for an economy of its size. And yet it has some major outlays that are out there. It has some very serious ambitions. A good way to translate Xi Jinping's and the Communist Party's slogans for China, if one were to take the Chinese and translate it into the equivalent in English, it's make China great again. That's what China is seeking to do. When we want to make ourselves great again, that's okay. When China wants to make itself great again, we have a problem with that. Again, applying different standards. But China's trying to make itself great again, and it's got a lot of things that it wants to do toward that end that cost a lot of money. So you're exactly right. I do think that the conventional wisdom about China is that there is some rot and dysfunctionality within the financial system of China. There is an awful lot of bad debt. There is mismanagement. There is a profound level of corruption in that one-party state. And as I pointed out, even if you do an anti-corruption campaign within a one-party state, you'll never be able to root out more than maybe 5% of the corruption that exists, because what you need to root out corruption are multiple sources of power that can check each other. And that's precisely what does not exist in China. So corruption is endemic and a very serious challenge. Bottom line, my sense is that unless China gets its own financial house in order, at some point down the line, those challenges are going to become very formidable for China, notwithstanding its generally very high level of economic performance, the industriousness of its people, and so forth and so on, as well as some of the things it does that are improper, such as theft of intellectual property, gaming the system, and other illegal or inappropriate economic activities. Apart from that, I think China does have to get a handle on its finances. I think it's cognizant of that. It's a well understood problem in China. But I will say what I have perceived in my 36 years of dealing with China, dating back to when I was in my teens, and certainly about 30 years of dealing with China professionally, China has a remarkable proclivity to be able to adapt to new situations, new realities, and to show resiliency. And there are a lot of people that have for decades argued that bad debt in China is going to sink China and make it into a third-rate has-been of a country. I don't hear those people saying that today, but they've been saying it for 30 years. So, the notion that these things are going to sink China, I think, is probably overstated. But you're absolutely right in your assessment, and that these are challenges, and I think significant challenges, that Chinese policymakers are going to have to confront at some point. That being said, let me also put it in perspective. Our country is what, now 25, 26 trillion dollars, 27 trillion maybe in debt. Our average annual deficit in recent years has been around $1 trillion. It's much more than that, multiples of that now because of COVID-19, probably will be multiples of that for a couple of years at least. So we now have a hole that, we can't balance a budget once. How are we going to pay down $27 trillion of debt, including 1 trillion of which held by China, and trillions held by others as well. China has its fiscal problems. We have our fiscal problems. And I think both of our countries will find a way to be resilient relative to these profound challenges that we respectively face.
Thank you so much. This has been a wonderful presentation. I can't thank you enough for spending some time with us. And to all our members, thank you for attending today's presentation. Please remember that we have an annual membership meeting today at 3 p.m. I hope you can all log on for that. Our next speaker series webinar is September 15th with Ambassador Thomas Krajewski. You can register for that today. Or for more information on our programs or to join our mailing list, please visit our website at csworldaffairs.org. So David, thank you. This has been wonderful. Thank you for spending time with us.
Karen, thank you so much. Thank you to everybody. Look forward to seeing you again. Thank you.
Okay.